Experience the intimate world of Pompeii's final night, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest. Marcus Flavius stood in his workshop as the afternoon light began its slow retreat across the stone floor. The dough beneath his hands yielded with familiar resistance, each fold a conversation between baker and grain that had been spoken here for 27 years. His father had worked this same marble surface, had felt the same give and take of wheat and water, salt and time. The rhythm was everything. Press, fold, turn, press again. His weathered fingers, permanently stained with flour, moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding each motion. Through the narrow window, he could hear children playing in the street, their voices carrying the particular joy of evening games when the day's heat had finally broken. He paused to wipe his brow with the back of his wrist, careful not to contaminate the dough with sweat. Tomorrow's bread was taking shape under his hands. Loaves for the senator's household, small rolls for the widow next door, who always paid in copper coins worn smooth by countless transactions. Each customer's needs lived in his fingers, in the way he shaped their daily sustenance. The workshop held the accumulated warmth of the day's baking, stone ovens still radiating heat like sleeping beasts. Clay amphora stood sentinel against the walls, filled with oil that would never be used, grain that would never see flour. But Marcus knew nothing of tomorrow's impossibility. He knew only the satisfaction of work well done, the pride of feeding his neighbors, the hope that his son would one day stand where he stood now. The bronze scales hung motionless in the still air, their brass weights arranged in perfect order, measures his grandfather had used, measures that had weighed out countless portions of sustenance. The wooden paddles, darkened by decades of use, leaned against the wall like old friends waiting their turn. Each tool held its own memory, its own story of service. He could feel the gluten developing beneath his palms, that mysterious transformation that turned simple ingredients into something that could sustain life. The alchemy of bread-making still amazed him after all these years. How flour and water could become something greater than the sum of their parts. How time and temperature and the baker's touch could create nourishment from dust. As the light continued its retreat, he began to hum, an old tune his father had hummed, and his father's father before him. The melody seemed to rise from the dough itself, from the stone walls, from the very essence of this place where bread had been born each day for generations. His hands never stopped moving, never stopped their ancient dance with grain and time, creating tomorrow's nourishment in the golden light of what would be Pompeii's final afternoon. The last motes of flower drifted through the amber air like tiny prayers, settling on surfaces already blessed by years of honest work. Marcus smiled, a quiet satisfaction spreading through his chest like warmth from the ovens themselves. Livia Cassia moved through her atrium with a measured grace of evening ritual, her sandals whispering against polished stone. The bronze figurines of the household gods caught the lamplight, their faces seeming to shift and breathe in the dancing flame. She had performed this ceremony every evening since her marriage 15 years ago. Yet tonight it felt different somehow, more precious, more necessary. Her lips moved in words her grandmother had taught her, Latin syllables worn smooth by generations of repetition. The wine she poured caught the light like liquid amber, each drop a small offering to the invisible forces that protected her family. The breadcrumbs scattered with deliberate care, the grapes arranged just so, each element of the offering placed with the precision of love. The smoke from the incense curled upward, carrying her unspoken prayers toward the painted ceiling where garden scenes bloomed, eternal in pigment and hope. From the impluvium came the gentle sound of water, the heartbeat of the house, constant and reassuring. Her daughter's cough had worried her today, just a small thing, but mothers carry every small thing in their hearts like stones. She adjusted her stola with unconscious grace, the familiar weight of the wool a comfort against her skin. The frescoes on the walls depicted scenes of abundance, vines heavy with fruit, birds in perpetual song, flowers that would never wilt. Tonight they seemed almost to move in the lamplight, as if the painted world were more alive than the real one. Through the open doorway, jasmine scent drifted from the garden, mixing with the olive oil smoke and incense. She thought of her husband, working late at the docks, of her daughter sleeping fitfully upstairs, of her son learning his letters with the patience of childhood, all of them held in this moment, in this light, in these words that had been spoken in this house since before memory began. The floor beneath her feet held the day's warmth, but she could feel the subtle shift as evening claimed the house, stone by stone. Her mother had stood in this same spot, had spoken these same words, had felt this same mixture of gratitude and unnameable longing that came with the day's end. The continuity of it was both comfort and burden, to be part of something larger than herself, yet responsible for keeping it alive. The lamp flame steadied, and she felt the presence of her ancestors in the warm air. Generations of women who had stood in this same spot, offering the same prayers, tending the same eternal flame that connected the living to the dead, the present to all the tomorrows that would never come. She lingered a moment longer, reluctant to break the spell of this perfect evening, this moment when all was well, all was tended, all was held in the gentle embrace of ritual and love. Quintus Hortensius stepped into his small garden as the evening air began to cool, his clay watering vessel heavy in hands that had once been steady enough to copy the finest manuscripts. The sound of water meeting thirsty earth was one of life's purest pleasures, simple, necessary, eternal. At 67, he had learned to find meaning in such small ceremonies. The basil released its sharp sweetness as water touched the leaves, and he breathed deeply, storing the scent in the library of memory where all precious things were kept. His fingers, gnarled now with arthritis, but still gentle, brushed against the tomato vines, feeling for the promise of ripeness in fruit that would never reach his table. From his neighbor's fig tree came the liquid notes of a nightingale beginning its evening performance, and he paused in his watering to listen. How many evenings had he stood in this exact spot, tending these same plants, listening to the same eternal song? The thought brought not sadness, but a deep contentment, the satisfaction of a life lived in rhythm with the turning seasons. His wooden tools lay scattered on the raised bed's edge, simple implements worn smooth by years of use, extensions of his own hands. The clay vessels that held tomorrow's water sat in neat rows, their surfaces still warm from the day's sun. Everything in its place, everything tended with the care that comes from knowing each plant's particular needs. The soil beneath his plants was dark and rich, fed by years of careful composting, of kitchen scraps turned to gold through patience and time. He had mixed this earth himself, had carried it handful by handful from the fields beyond the city walls, had blessed it with his sweat and attention. Now it gave back, season after season, the gift of green life. The garden walls still held the day's heat, radiating warmth like gentle hands against his back as he worked. These stones had been laid by his own hands 20 years ago, each one chosen and placed with the deliberation of a man building something to last. The mortar between them was mixed with crushed shells from the bay, binding earth and sea in this small sanctuary. Smoke from evening cooking fires began to rise from neighboring houses, carrying the scents of garlic and oil, bread and wine. The first bats appeared against the darkening sky, their erratic flight a reminder that the day's work was ending, that night was claiming the city. He set down the watering vessel and looked up at the stars, beginning to emerge above Pompeii's rooftops. Venus hung low on the horizon, bright and steady, the same star that had watched over his childhood, his marriage, the birth of his children, the slow accumulation of years that had brought him to this garden, this moment, this perfect evening that felt somehow like a benediction. The earth beneath his sandals was dark with water, rich with the promise of growth that would never come. But Quintus knew only the peace of work completed, of plants tended, of another day's small duties fulfilled with the dignity that comes from a lifetime of careful attention to the world's quiet needs. Claudia knelt beside her son's sleeping alcove, the rough woolen blanket soft under her work-hardened hands. Gaius lay curled like a small animal seeking warmth, his dark hair tousled against the straw pillow, his breathing already beginning to slow toward sleep. At 5, he still fought the pull of dreams, wanting to hold on to every moment of his mother's presence. She began the old song her own mother had sung, words in the ancient tongue that spoke of protection and peace, of shepherds watching over sleeping flocks. Her voice, roughened by the steam of laundry work, gentled into melody, each note a small prayer for her child's safety, his future, his dreams. The melody carried her back to her own childhood, to evenings when her mother's voice had been the last sound before sleep claimed her. The lamp flame flickered, and she adjusted the wick with practiced fingers, creating just enough light to keep the darkness at bay without disturbing his rest. The painted walls of their small room showed simple geometric patterns, circles, and lines that seemed to dance in the lamplight, creating a world of gentle motion around her sleeping child. She had painted them herself, mixing pigments saved from her small earnings, wanting beauty in their modest home. Her fingers moved through his hair with infinite tenderness, feeling the silk of childhood that would too soon coarsen into the texture of manhood. Each touch carried her hopes that he would grow strong, that he would find work better than hers, that he would know love and laughter and the satisfaction of a life well lived. She thought of his father, gone these 2 years, and how he would have loved to see their son growing tall and curious about the world. From neighboring houses came the muffled sounds of other families settling into evening, conversations growing quieter, footsteps slowing, the gradual hush that falls over a city preparing for sleep. But here in this small room, the world contracted to just this moment, this child, this ancient ritual of mother and son. She smoothed the blanket over his small form, tucking it carefully around his shoulders. His breathing deepened, and she knew he was finally surrendering to sleep, trusting her to keep watch over his dreams. The weight of that trust was both burden and blessing, the fierce responsibility of maternal love. As she continued her quiet song, she thought of tomorrow, the laundry to be done, the coins to be earned, the endless cycle of work that kept them fed and sheltered. But for now, there was only this: the warmth of the lamp, the sound of her child's breathing, the ancient melody that connected her to all the mothers who had ever sung their children to sleep under the same stars that watched over Pompeii's final night. The shuttle moves through the warp threads with hypnotic rhythm, Livia's hands guiding it with the certainty of 30 years' practice. Each pass of the weft creates another line in what will become her daughter's wedding dress, white wool, fine as cloud. She pauses to adjust the tension, her fingers reading the threads like a musician reads notes, feeling for that perfect balance between give and hold. The lamp flickers, and she moves it closer, the light catching the growing fabric like moonlight on water. In this room where she has worked since she was younger than her daughter is now, every shadow holds memory. The basket of prepared wool sits beside her, each strand cleaned and combed until it gleams like silver in the lamplight. She remembers the sheep from which this wool came, how she selected each fleece herself at the market, feeling for quality with hands that knew the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. She thinks of her mother who taught her this craft, whose hands once moved as hers do now. The rhythm becomes a kind of prayer, each thread a blessing woven into the fabric that will clothe her daughter on the most important day of her life. The wedding is still months away, but already she can see it, the joy in her daughter's eyes, the way the dress will catch the morning light as she walks to meet her beloved. Her daughter doesn't yet know of the hours being spent here, the careful planning of each fold and seam. The evening air flows through the window, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden below. Somewhere in the distance she hears laughter, the sound of children playing their last games before sleep. But here, in her weaving room, time moves differently, measured not in hours, but in the accumulation of threads, the slow building of something beautiful and lasting. The loom itself was her mother's, its wood worn smooth by generations of hands, its frame solid as the day it was built. She holds up a section of the completed work, examining it in the lamplight. The weave is tight and even, the color pure as fresh snow. This dress will be more than clothing. It will be armor against uncertainty, a tangible expression of love that her daughter can wear and remember always. She thinks of her own wedding dress, simpler than this one, but woven with the same care by her mother's hands, now carefully preserved in the wooden chest beside her bed. Her daughter will wear this dress, and perhaps, if the gods are kind, her granddaughter after her. The thought fills her with a quiet satisfaction that goes deeper than pride. This is how love travels through time, not in grand gestures, but in the patient work of hands, the careful attention to detail, the hope stitched into every seam. She imagines future daughters, granddaughters she may never know, wearing this dress and feeling connected to this moment, to her hands working in the lamplight. The city grows quieter around her, the sounds of evening commerce fading into the gentle murmur of families at rest. A cat calls somewhere in the darkness, answered by another from across the narrow street. These are the sounds that have accompanied her work for decades. The rhythm of Pompeii settling into sleep. She works until her eyes grow heavy, until the lamp burns low, and the threads blur together in the gentle light. Tomorrow she will continue, and the day after that, until the dress is complete. But tonight, in the rhythm of the shuttle and the whisper of thread against thread, she finds the peace that comes from work done with love, from hands that know their purpose and fulfill it well. Talia's needle moves through the torn tunic with careful precision, each stitch a small act of care in a life not her own. The other servants speak in low voices around her, sharing the day's small victories and sorrows. A kind word from the mistress, a coin found in the street, news from the market that might mean work for a brother or cousin. She thinks of the olive groves of her childhood, the way the light fell through the leaves in patterns that changed with every breeze. So different from this Roman house where she tends another's children, where her days are measured not by seasons but by tasks completed, duties fulfilled. Yet there is kindness here too, in the cook who saves her extra bread, in the master's wife who speaks gently, in these quiet evening hours when they can simply be human together. Sometimes, in moments like this, she can almost forget the weight of the iron collar that marked her first years here, now replaced by the invisible bonds of familiarity and routine. The lamp creates a circle of warm light in the simple quarters they share, illuminating faces from distant lands, Greece like herself, Gaul, Egypt, Germania. Each carries stories of home, of families left behind, of lives interrupted and redirected by the fortunes of war and commerce. But they have become family to each other, bound not by blood, but by shared circumstance and mutual care. Old Helena from the northern provinces hums softly while she mends, a tune that speaks of forests and snow, so different from Talia's memories of Mediterranean sun. Young Marcus, barely 16 and homesick for his village in the mountains, shows them a wooden bird he's been carving. The older women praise his skill, and Talia sees how his face brightens, how their approval becomes a small gift in a life that offers few such moments. This is what they give each other: recognition, dignity, the acknowledgement that they are more than their circumstances. She remembers teaching him to read Latin letters, watching his wonder as words took shape under his careful finger, how knowledge became a kind of freedom even within captivity. She finishes the mending and folds the tunic carefully, adding it to the pile of completed work. Tomorrow there will be more. Through the small window comes the sound of the fountain in the master's garden, its gentle splash a constant music that has become as familiar as breathing. She has learned to find beauty even here, in the way moonlight falls across the courtyard stones, in the careful arrangement of the mistress's flowers, in the laughter of the children she tends. The others begin to settle for sleep, their voices growing softer, more distant. Thalia lies on her simple mattress and listens to their breathing, to the sounds of the house settling around them. In the darkness, she holds on to the small kindnesses of the day, the moments of connection that make even this constrained life bearable, even beautiful in its own quiet way. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, surrounded by these chosen family members, she finds a peace that no master can take from her. Lucius raises his cup in a small toast to the day's blessings, the wine catching the lamplight like liquid amber. His wife smiles across the low table, her face warm in the flickering glow, and their children's voices mix with the evening air that flows through the open windows. The meal is simple but abundant. Bread still warm from Marcus's bakery, olives from their own trees, cheese aged in their own cellars. He listens to his eldest son describe his lessons, the boy's enthusiasm for rhetoric and mathematics, filling the room with energy. Pride warms his chest more than the wine as he watches his son gesture excitedly, already showing the confidence that will serve him well in the world. His daughter, Younger, but equally bright, adds her own observations, and he marvels at how quickly they are growing, how their minds expand with each passing day. His wife catches his eye and smiles, understanding passing between them without words. They have built something good here, not just the business that provides their comfort, but this family, this home where love flows as freely as wine. The painted walls around them depict vineyards heavy with fruit, a reminder of the source of their prosperity. But tonight, the real wealth sits at this table. The shadows dance across the frescoes, and for a moment he remembers his own father's house, smaller and darker, where meals were hurried affairs between the demands of trade. How different his children's lives are from his own youth, when uncertainty shadowed every decision. He had promised himself then that if fortune smiled upon him, he would create something lasting, something beautiful. Looking around this room, at these faces illuminated by gentle lamplight, he knows he has kept that promise. The conversation turns to plans, his son's education, his daughter's future, the expansion of the wine trade that will secure their comfort for years to come. Lucius speaks of new partnerships, of ships that will carry their wine to distant ports. But his real attention is on these faces, these voices that make every day's work meaningful. Success, he has learned, is not measured in coins but in moments like these. As the meal winds down, he feels the deep satisfaction that comes from a day well lived, a family well loved. The wine has made him philosophical, and he thinks about how quickly time passes, how precious these ordinary evenings are. His children will grow and leave, his hair will gray, seasons will turn, but tonight they are all here together, safe and content in the glow of lamplight and love. The servants move quietly around them, clearing the remnants of the meal with practiced efficiency. He notices how his wife's hand rests gently on their daughter's shoulder, how his son's eyes still shine with the day's discoveries. These small gestures, these fleeting expressions, they are what he will remember, long after the business concerns of tomorrow fade from memory. The oil in the lamps burns steady and true, casting everything in warm gold, making even the simplest objects seem precious. Later, when the children have been sent to bed and he sits with his wife in comfortable silence, he will think about how blessed they are. But for now, he simply listens to the sound of his family's happiness, storing it in his heart like treasure that no thief can steal. Gaius's voice carries across the small courtyard like music, weaving tales of gods and heroes, while children lean forward with wide eyes and adults smile at familiar stories made new. His hands move as he speaks, painting pictures in the air, and the oil lamps seem to flicker in rhythm with his words. Tonight, he tells of Odysseus, of the long journey home, and how even heroes must sometimes wait for the right wind to fill their sails. An old woman nods at a particularly well-turned phrase, her weathered face creasing with approval. She has heard this story countless times, but Gaius brings something fresh to each telling, a new detail, a different emphasis, a pause that makes the familiar seem surprising again. a young father holds his daughter closer as the story grows exciting, and Gaius sees how the child's imagination catches fire, how her eyes reflect the lamplight like stars. Above them, the first real stars appear in the darkening sky. And Gaius thinks how stories, like stars, have always guided people through the darkness. They connect us to something larger than our daily concerns, to heroes and gods, to the great patterns that repeat themselves across generations. In his voice, Odysseus becomes real again, his struggles and triumphs echoing in the hearts of merchants and servants, children and elders. He watches their faces as he speaks, reading their responses, adjusting his pace and tone to hold their attention. This is his gift, not just the words themselves, but the way he weaves them together, the rhythm and music that transforms mere narrative into something approaching magic. The youngest children fight sleep, unwilling to miss a single word, while their parents find in the familiar stories a comfort that goes deeper than entertainment. As the tale reaches its climax, the courtyard grows still except for his voice and the soft crackle of flame. Even the city beyond seems to quiet, as if the whole world is listening. This is why he tells stories, not for the few coins they sometimes bring, but for moments like these, when words become bridges between souls, when the ancient past speaks to the present, when strangers become community through shared wonder. When the tale ends and the audience begins to disperse, children carried sleepily to bed and adults returning to their evening tasks, Gaius feels the deep satisfaction of work well done. Tomorrow there will be other stories, other audiences, but tonight he has given his neighbors something precious, a few moments of magic in ordinary lives, a reminder that even in the smallest courtyard, under the humblest lamps, the great stories continue to unfold. Sextus Nigidius moved through the narrow streets with the measured pace of a man who had walked these paths for 30 years, his leather bag heavy with herbs and remedies against his hip. The oil lamp in his free hand cast wavering shadows on the worn walls, and he thought, as he often did in these evening hours, how the light seemed to reveal more than it illuminated. At the first house he found the old man propped against pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. Sextus placed his palm against the weathered forehead, feeling for the heat that had burned there for 3 days. The fever had broken, finally, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He measured dried willow bark into a clay cup, his fingers moving with the precision of decades. "Steep this when the moon reaches its peak," he told the man's daughter, his voice carrying the authority that came not from learning, but from countless nights like this one. The second house held a woman in labor with her fourth child, and here Sextus found himself in the role he cherished most, not fighting death, but welcoming life. The midwife had everything well in hand, but she nodded gratefully when he checked the mother's pulse, when he listened to the strong heartbeat beneath his ear. Before dawn, he told the waiting father, and saw the man's shoulders relax with relief. Walking between houses, Sextus felt the weight of his calling settle around him like a familiar cloak. He had learned long ago that healing was less about curing than about bearing witness, about carrying the burden of another's pain until they were strong enough to carry it themselves. His own back ached, his eyes strained in the lamplight, but these discomforts seemed insignificant beside the trust placed in his hands. The third house contained a child with a persistent cough, and Sextus knelt beside the small bed with the gentleness he reserved for the very young and very old. The boy's mother watched anxiously as he listened to the child's chest, as he prepared a mixture of honey and thyme. The cough will ease by morning, he promised, and meant it, for he had learned to distinguish between the coughs that threatened and those that merely lingered. As he walked home through the quiet streets, Sextus reflected on the strange privilege of his profession. He alone, among his neighbors, was invited into the most intimate moments of human experience, birth and death, pain and healing, the terrible vulnerability that came with illness. Each house held its own story of struggle, its own quiet heroism, and he carried them all like a priest carried prayers. Tonight, like every night, he had done what he could with his limited knowledge, his fallible hands. Tomorrow there would be other houses, other needs, the endless cycle of human frailty and resilience. He thought of the old man's fever breaking, the woman's strong labor, the child's trusting eyes, and felt again that deep satisfaction that came not from conquering illness, but from serving it, from being present in the darkness until the light returned. Julia's hand rested lightly on Marcus's arm as they walked the quiet residential street, their voices low in the evening air so as not to disturb the peace that had settled over the neighborhood like a blessing. The oil lamps glowing in the windows cast pools of warm light on the smooth pavement, and she thought how beautiful the world looked tonight, how full of promise and possibility. "My mother showed me the cloth she's weaving for our marriage bed," Julia said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, even in the darkness. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, and she could hear the smile in his voice when he replied, "My father says he'll have the house ready by the harvest moon. Just 2 rooms, but they'll be ours." They paused beneath a flowering vine that cascaded over a garden wall, its jasmine perfume sweet in the cooling air. Julia closed her eyes and breathed in the scent, trying to memorize this moment, the warmth of Marcus's presence beside her, the soft sounds of families settling for the night, the way the stars seemed to shine just for them. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Marcus turned to face her, his hand finding her cheek in the lamplight. "Sometimes I wake in the morning and think I've dreamed you," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then I remember that you're real, that you've chosen me, and I feel like the luckiest man in all of Pompeii. They resumed walking, their steps slow and reluctant, neither wanting this evening to end. Julia thought of the small house Marcus described, of the life they would build together within its walls. She imagined mornings when she would wake beside him, evenings when they would sit together as her parents did. The comfortable silence of two people who had chosen each other completely. "Will you be happy, do you think?" she asked suddenly, the question surprising them both. Marcus stopped walking and took both her hands in his dark eyes serious in the flickering light. "Happy," he repeated. "Julia, I think I will be so happy that the gods themselves will grow jealous." They stood there in the quiet street, young and in love, and certain that their happiness was as eternal as the stars above them. The scent of bread from the morning's baking still lingered in Julia's hair, and Marcus breathed it in like incense. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying all the weight of forever. As they walked toward Julia's house, she felt as if she were floating, as if the very air had become lighter. Tomorrow she would help her mother with the wedding preparations, would fold linens and arrange flowers, and count the days until she became Marcus's wife. But tonight was perfect just as it was. The slow walk through the quiet streets, this moment when everything seemed possible, when love felt like the most natural thing in the world. When they reached her door, Marcus kissed her hand formally, properly, but his eyes held promises that made her heart race. "Until tomorrow," he whispered, and Julia nodded, already counting the hours until she would see him again. Antonia moved through her small courtyard with the deliberate grace of a woman who had learned to find peace in solitude, her silver hair catching the last light from the oil lamp as she approached the household shrine. The jasmine she carried had been Marcus's favorite. He had planted the vine himself in their second year of marriage, when hope still lived in her womb and the future stretched endlessly ahead. She arranged the white flowers before his memorial tablet with the same care she had once used to dress his hair, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. 15 years he had been gone, 15 years since fever had taken him in 3 terrible days, and still she spoke to him each evening as if he might answer, as if death were merely another room in the house they had shared. "The jasmine bloomed early this year," she told him, pouring a small libation of wine onto the earth beside the shrine. "You would have said it was because I've been talking to it, encouraging it like I used to encourage you when you doubted yourself." The wine darkened the soil, and she watched it disappear, imagining it reaching him somehow in whatever place he now dwelled. The evening air carried the scent of cooking fires from neighboring houses, and Antonia felt again that strange mixture of loneliness and contentment that had become her daily companion. She had grown accustomed to preparing meals for one, to the quiet house that no longer echoed with his laughter, to the bed that held only her dreams. Yet there was peace in this solitude too, a different kind of love that had grown from the ashes of what they had shared. "I saw young Julia today," she continued, settling on to the stone bench where she and Marcus had spent so many evenings planning their future. Walking with her betrothed, so full of joy she seemed to glow. It reminded me of us. Do you remember? How certain we were that love could conquer anything? The oil lamp flickered in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows on the shrine, and Antonia felt Marcus's presence as strongly as if he sat beside her. She remembered how he used to worry about providing for her, about being worthy of her father's trust, and how she had laughed at his fears. "You were always worthy," she said aloud, "more worthy than you ever knew." Around her, the city was settling into its evening rhythms, doors closing, voices fading to murmurs, the comfortable sounds of a community at rest. Antonia had found her place in this rhythm, had learned to be alone without being lonely, to carry love like a lamp that never dimmed. She thought of the couples still discovering each other, the families still growing, and felt no envy, only gratitude for what she had known. "I'll see you in my dreams," she promised, as she did every night, and rose to extinguish the lamp. The jasmine would continue to bloom in the darkness, its perfume a bridge between memory and hope, between what was lost and what endured. In the morning she would wake alone, but she would not wake empty. Love, she had learned, was not something that ended with death, but something that transformed, becoming deeper and more precious for its fragility. As she prepared for sleep, Antonia felt the peace that came from accepting what could not be changed, while cherishing what could never be taken away. Across the sleeping city of Pompeii, the rhythm of night settled like a blessing over the narrow streets and modest houses, as if the very stones exhaled the day's warmth into the star-filled darkness. In the bakery district, Marcus banked the fires in his ovens, the last heat that would warm the morning's bread, while 3 streets away, Livia folded her days weaving, her fingers smoothing the cloth that would become a child's tunic. Quintus made his final round of the garden, watering the herbs that would flavor tomorrow's meals, his weathered hands gentle with the tender shoots. The fountain in the small courtyard caught the lamplight, its quiet splash a counterpoint to the settling sounds of the neighborhood. Children's voices, bright with the day's adventures, gradually softened to sleepy murmurs as mothers sang ancient lullabies and fathers told familiar stories. Throughout the city, the sound of doors being secured for the night echoed gently through the streets, not with fear, but with the comfortable ritual of a community that trusted its peace. Iron bars slid into place, keys turned in well-oiled locks, and families gathered for the evening's final prayers to their household gods. The oil lamps that had guided the day's work began to dim one by one, leaving pools of warm light that gradually gave way to the silver radiance of the stars. The night watchman began his rounds, his measured pace a comfort to those still awake, his presence a promise that the city slept under protection. His voice carried the traditional greeting, "All is well," from corner to corner, and windows opened briefly to acknowledge his passing before closing again in contentment. The rhythm of his steps became part of the night's symphony, joining the whisper of wind through the narrow passages and the distant sound of waves against the harbor walls. In the physician's house, Sextus finally set down his medical bag and allowed his tired shoulders to relax, while across the city, Julia's mother folded the wedding linens one more time, her heart full of plans for her daughter's happiness. The widow Antonia spoke her evening words to memory, and in the grand villa on the hill, even Gaius Plinius set aside his scrolls to gaze out at the city he served with such dedication. Above it all, Mount Vesuvius stood silent against the star-scattered sky, its slopes dark and peaceful, giving no hint of the fire that slept in its depths. The mountain that had blessed the region with fertile soil and abundant harvests seemed as eternal as the stars themselves, as much a part of the landscape as the sea that sparkled beyond the harbor. This was Pompeii's gift, not its grand amphitheater or its bustling forum, but this, the quiet confidence of ordinary people living ordinary lives, secure in their routines, trusting in tomorrow. Bakers and weavers, physicians and magistrates, young lovers and grieving widows, all settling into sleep with the certainty that morning would bring another day of familiar joys and manageable sorrows. They could not know, these sleeping citizens, that their simple evening rituals would become sacred in memory, that their last ordinary night would be preserved forever in ash and time. They slept in peace, and in their peace lay a beauty that no catastrophe could diminish, the beauty of human life lived fully, loved deeply, and trusted completely to the promise of dawn. Marcus Flavius had risen before dawn for 30 years, his body attuned to the rhythms of bread and fire. But this morning, something felt different. The familiar weight of flour dust on his windowsill had been replaced by something finer, stranger. He traced the gray residue with his finger, the same finger that could judge the readiness of dough by touch alone. The ash, for ash it surely was, carried no scent of his ovens. No warmth of wheat or barley, no ghost of yesterday's baking. This dust spoke of deeper fires, of places beneath the earth where no baker's hand had ever reached. His practiced fingers, stained permanently with flour, rolled the particles between thumb and forefinger. They felt ancient, mineral, carrying within them the whispers of stone and deep earth. The bakery around him held its familiar embrace, stone walls that had absorbed decades of yeast and grain, wooden shelves worn smooth by countless loaves. In the ovens, embers pulsed like distant heartbeats, maintaining the low heat that would soon roar into the day's first fires. Yet even these familiar sounds seemed muted, as if the very air had thickened. Marcus had seen ash before, from his ovens, from neighbors' cooking fires, from the occasional burning of refuse in the streets. But this carried something else, something that made his baker's instincts recoil, The particles caught the moonlight streaming through his shutters, each speck glittering like a fallen star, beautiful and somehow ominous. He thought of his father, who had worked these same ovens, and his grandfather before him. 3 generations of Flavius bakers, and none had ever described ash like this. The flame of his lamp seemed to lean away from the window-sill, as if even fire recognized something foreign in these gray whispers from the mountain. Marcus wiped his finger on his tunic, but the ash clung stubbornly, marking him with its mineral touch. Tomorrow he would ask old Gaius about it. The wine merchant had traveled widely, might recognize such things, but for now he turned back to his dough, seeking comfort in the familiar alchemy of flour and water, even as the strange ash continued to settle silently on his sill. Livia Cassia had always found peace in her waving room at night. The loom stood patient in the moonlight, her day's work stretched across its frame like captured dreams. But tonight, the wool threads trembled without any breeze to stir them. She approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The threads quivered like harp strings touched by invisible fingers, each strand catching silver light and releasing it in tiny shivers. No wind moved through her shutters. No breath of air disturbed the hanging herbs, yet her loom sang its silent song. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years. The earth speaks before it acts, child. Animals flee, threads dance, stones whisper. Old Sabina had lived through the great earthquake in her youth, had spoken of signs that preceded the shaking. Livia had dismissed such talk as superstition, the fears of an old woman whose mind wandered between past and present. But now, watching her careful work tremble in the stillness, she felt the weight of inherited wisdom. The wool she had spun that afternoon, dyed with precious purple from distant shores, responded to something her own senses could not detect. The loom's wooden frame creaked softly, oak responding to vibrations too subtle for human perception. Livia Cassia had always found peace in her waving room at night. The loom stood patient in the moonlight, her day's work stretched across its frame like captured dreams. But tonight, the wool threads trembled without any breeze to stir them. She approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The threads quivered like harp strings touched by invisible fingers, each strand catching silver light and releasing it in tiny shivers. No wind moved through her shutters. No breath of air disturbed the hanging herbs, yet her loom sang its silent song. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years. The earth speaks before it acts, child. Animals flee, threads dance, stones whisper. Old Sabina had lived through the great earthquake in her youth, had spoken of signs that preceded the shaking. Livia had dismissed such talk as superstition, the fears of an old woman whose mind wandered between past and present. But now, watching her careful work tremble in the stillness, she felt the weight of inherited wisdom. The wool she had spun that afternoon, dyed with precious purple from distant shores, responded to something her own senses could not detect. The loom's wooden frame creaked softly, oak responding to vibrations too subtle for human perception. Quintus Hortensius prided himself on his powers of observation. Years of scholarly discipline had trained his eye to notice details others missed, to catalogue and analyze the world's infinite variations. But the behavior of his oil lamp tonight defied every principle he had learned. The flame stretched and cowered in patterns that followed no earthly logic. One moment it reached toward the mountain, pulled as if by invisible hands. The next it huddled low in its bronze vessel, seeking shelter from some unfelt wind. The olive oil surface rippled in tiny waves, though his study remained perfectly still. Around him, papyrus scrolls rustled without cause, their edges lifting and falling like breathing parchment. Words he had read 1,000 times seemed strange in the dancing light, familiar Greek and Latin texts transforming into something foreign under the lamp's erratic glow. Shadows moving, shadows leaped and retreated across his careful notes, making his own handwriting appear alien. Quintus set down his stylus and studied the flame with the same intensity he brought to ancient texts. The light seemed to taste the air, responding to invisible currents that spoke of disturbance in the natural order. He had read accounts of such phenomena, Pliny the Elder's observations of unusual atmospheric conditions, Aristotle's theories about vapors and earthquakes. But reading about such things in the safety of daylight was different from witnessing them in the intimate darkness of his study. The lamp's behavior suggested the presence of gases, of underground disturbances that affected even the air itself. His scholarly mind raced through possibilities, cataloguing symptoms against his vast reading. The familiar smell of iron gall ink seemed sharper tonight, more metallic, as if the very air had changed its capacity to carry scents. The corners of his room held deeper darkness than usual, as if light itself grew uncertain. Even his most precious manuscripts, works copied from the great library at Alexandria, seemed to shrink from the unstable illumination. Knowledge, he reflected, was only valuable when it could be applied, when observation led to understanding. His writing tablets felt warm to the touch, the wax softening, though no fire burned near them. The bronze lamp holder, inherited from his father and his father before him, conducted heat that seemed to rise from below rather than radiate from the flame above. Quintus pressed his palm against the metal, feeling warmth that spoke of deep earth processes, of the mountain's influence reaching even into his private sanctuary of learning. The dry scrolls responded to changes in humidity he couldn't detect, their edges curling and straightening in rhythm with invisible atmospheric pressures. Quintus reached for a fresh scroll, intending to record these observations for posterity. But as he began to write, the flame gave one final, desperate stretch toward the mountain before settling into an ominous, steady burn. The sudden stillness felt more threatening than all the previous dancing, a calm that spoke not of peace but of gathering storm. In this moment of artificial tranquility, he understood that his years of study had prepared him to witness, but not to prevent what was coming. Claudia had soothed countless crying children in her 30 years of motherhood. She knew the difference between hunger cries and pain cries, between the fussing of a wet cloth and the wailing of fever. But the sounds her youngest made tonight carried an urgency she had never heard before. The infant's eyes darted constantly toward the window that faced the mountain, tiny fists clenching and unclenching as if grasping at invisible threats. No amount of rocking or singing could settle the child, whose cries seemed to echo something deeper than physical discomfort. Around them, her other children tossed fitfully on their straw mattresses, caught in restless dreams. Claudia remembered her grandmother's wisdom. Babies and animals know what we have forgotten, child. They feel the earth's moods before we do. The old woman had delivered half the children in their district, had seen how infants grew restless before storms, how they cried inconsolably before the great earthquake of her youth. The very walls seemed to press inward tonight, making their modest home feel smaller, more confining. Even familiar sounds carried different weight, the settling of timbers, the whisper of wind through gaps in the shutters, the distant barking of dogs throughout the neighborhood. The air itself tasted strange, metallic and charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. She moved to check on her other children, finding them all caught in the same restless sleep. Their small bodies twisted and turned, seeking comfort that would not come. The youngest, barely walking, sat up in his sleep and pointed toward the mountain, his eyes still closed, his mouth forming words too young for speech. Claudia returned to her crying baby, pressing the child close to her heart. Through the thin walls, she could hear similar sounds from neighboring houses, the restless crying of infants, the whimpering of dogs, the nervous lowing of cattle in distant pens. The entire district seemed caught in the same inexplicable unease. As she rocked her child, Claudia felt the faintest vibration through the soles of her feet, a tremor so subtle it might have been her imagination. But her baby's cries intensified at that exact moment, tiny lungs protesting something only the most innocent could perceive. She continued her gentle rocking, a mother's instinct awakening to dangers she could not yet name, trusting in the ancient wisdom that flowed through generations of women who had learned to read the earth's subtle warnings. Marcus stepped from his bakery into the moonlit street, curiously drawn by sounds he couldn't quite identify. The street dog, a lean creature with intelligent eyes that had haunted these alleys for seasons, paced in tight circles near the fountain, its movements sharp with distress. He had seen this dog before, always moving with purpose through Pompeii's streets, scavenging with the wisdom of survival. Tonight was different. The creature's amber eyes fixed on Mount Vesuvius, its body trembling with knowledge that seemed to bypass human understanding entirely. Marcus found himself following as the dog trotted toward the mountain's base, then returned, then repeated the pattern. The cobblestones felt unusually warm beneath his sandals, as if heated from below rather than cooled by night air. His grandfather had often spoken of animals as Earth's first witnesses, creatures whose senses reached deeper than human perception. The old man had watched birds before storms, noted how cats abandoned buildings before they collapsed, trusted the wisdom of creatures closer to elemental truth. The street dog paused, looking directly at Marcus with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. Around them, the familiar street felt transformed. Shuttered windows like closed eyes refusing to see, doorways that seemed to lean away from the mountain's presence. The dog's distress spoke in a language older than Latin, older than human words, a vocabulary of scent and vibration that his baker's practical mind struggled to interpret. Marcus walked behind the animal as it led him through narrow passages he'd known since childhood, each path somehow altered by the creature's urgent navigation. The mountain's silhouette loomed larger than memory suggested, its familiar peak lost in clouds that seemed to swallow stars rather than drift past them. The dog stopped at the street's end where the road began its climb toward Vesuvius and released a long, mournful howl that echoed off stone walls. Standing there in the warm night air, Marcus felt his certainties shifting like sand. The bread would rise tomorrow, the ovens would heat, the familiar rhythms would continue. These beliefs felt suddenly fragile against the animal's primal knowledge. The dog's warning carried the authority of instinct, of senses attuned to Earth's deeper conversations, communications that his human logic had learned to dismiss but could no longer ignore in the face of such obvious distress. Livia made her way to the central well, carrying the clay pitcher that had served her family's needs for years. The familiar courtyard felt different in the moonlight. Shadows fell at angles that seemed wrong, and the air carried scents she couldn't identify. As she lowered her bucket into the well's depths, the echo that returned sounded hollow, as if the earth itself had developed new caverns. The bucket struck water with a sound that seemed too deep, too resonant for the well she'd used countless times. When she drew it up, the water caught moonlight in patterns that pulsed rather than rippled. And the taste spoke of minerals and heat, of sulfur rising through stone channels she'd never imagined existed beneath their familiar streets. Her loom work required pure water for the finest threads, and she'd always trusted this source above all others. Tonight, the liquid carried flavors that belonged to depths rather than springs, to heated stone rather than cool earth. She dipped her fingers into the pitcher, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with air temperature, everything to do with the mountain's influence reaching even here, into their most essential source of life. The courtyard's fountain, which had provided the soundtrack to countless evening conversations, sounded irregular tonight, its flow interrupted by air bubbles or pressure changes that made the familiar melody stutter and pause. Even the well's rim felt warm to her touch, unusual for night hours when stone typically released the day's heat into cooling air. She traced the carved patterns around the well's edge, decorations her grandfather had chiseled decades ago, feeling how the stone itself seemed to pulse with internal warmth. Livia thought of her mother, who had drawn water from this same well, and her grandmother before that. Generations of women had trusted this source, had built their households around its reliability. She could almost see them in the moonlight, ghostly figures carrying their own clay vessels, speaking in whispers about daily concerns that seemed trivial now. Tonight, that continuity felt threatened by changes rising from depths they'd never considered, alterations in the very foundation of their daily existence. As she filled her pitcher, the liquid seemed heavier than usual, weighted with minerals that belonged to the mountain's heart, rather than the gentle aquifer they'd always assumed fed their well. The courtyard stones beneath her feet felt different too, warmer, as if heated from below by processes that had nothing to do with the sun's daily cycle. The familiar geometry of the space seemed altered by these subtle changes, angles and distances made strange by the mountain's influence. The water would serve for tonight's weaving, but its altered taste would remind her that nothing, not even the most fundamental elements of life, remained unchanged when the mountain stirred. She lifted the pitcher, feeling its weight as both burden and blessing, carrying within it the story of their changing world. Quintus walked the road that connected Pompeii to its neighboring settlements, seeking the solitude that had always helped him organize his thoughts. Tonight, however, the familiar path offered something unexpected, absolute emptiness, where activity should have thrived. The Roman road, engineered to carry commerce and communication between towns, stretched before him like an abandoned monument. His scholarly mind began cataloging the absence with the same precision he applied to historical texts. No cartwheels grinding against stone, no voices of late merchants calculating profit and loss, no torches moving between settlements like fireflies carrying human purpose through darkness. Even the bandits who usually prowled these paths had vanished, as if all life retreated from some approaching presence his education couldn't yet name. The road's stones still radiated the day's heat, but the warmth felt different, more intense, as if the earth itself ran a fever that infected even constructed surfaces. Roadside shrines stood unattended, their oil lamps unlit, their usual offerings of bread and wine absent. The gods, it seemed, would receive no petitions tonight from travelers who had chosen other routes or simply stayed home. Quintus paused at a milestone that marked the distance to Nuceria, remembering how this same spot usually buzzed with activity, farmers returning from market, messengers carrying news between cities, young people walking between towns to visit lovers or family. Tonight, the silence felt absolute, broken only by his own footsteps and the unusual absence of even natural sounds. He recalled his father bringing him along this very road as a child, teaching him to read the milestones, explaining how Roman engineering connected their world, like veins carrying life through a vast body. Those lessons had filled him with pride in civilization's achievements, But tonight, the same stones felt like monuments to human hubris. Pathways leading nowhere, connections severed by forces beyond imperial control. The wind itself seemed to avoid this path, leaving an unnatural stillness that made his breathing sound too loud, his movement too significant. From his studies, he knew that animals often fled before earthquakes, that birds abandoned areas before storms. Perhaps humans, too, possessed instincts they'd learned to ignore, primitive wisdom that bypassed rational thought and simply said, "Not here, not tonight, not this road." Looking back toward Pompeii, he could see a faint illumination that didn't belong to torches or oil lamps, a glow that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. The light painted the empty road in copper tones, transforming familiar stones into something otherworldly, as if the very infrastructure of their civilization was being rewritten by forces that predated Rome itself. Standing alone on the empty highway, Quintus felt his scholarly confidence wavering. Books could explain historical patterns, but they couldn't account for this systematic abandonment, this collective unconscious decision to avoid paths that had served as lifelines for generations. The absence itself had become a presence, silence transformed into communication, emptiness speaking louder than any crowd could manage. The road's desertion felt like a message written in a language his education had never taught him to read. Without planning or arrangement, they found themselves drawn to the Forum as if pulled by invisible threads. Marcus from his bakery street, Livia from the well, Quintus from the empty road, and Claudia from her restless wandering. The moonlit marble columns created a natural amphitheater for their unintended gathering, each carrying private discoveries that suddenly demanded sharing. Marcus spoke first, his voice hesitant but determined. The street dog's warning, he explained, had felt like a message from some deeper intelligence, an animal wisdom that his practical mind could no longer dismiss. Livia nodded, describing water that tasted of sulfur and depths, of changes rising through stone channels into their most trusted sources. Quintus added his observation of the empty roads, the systematic abandonment that his scholarly training couldn't explain, but his instincts recognized as significant. Claudia, her voice soft but certain, spoke of her daughter's restless sleep, of ash that appeared without source, of domestic details that pointed toward something larger than any individual concern. The Forum's familiar architecture seemed transformed by their conversation. Marble steps warm underfoot despite the night hour, statues of gods appearing more alert than usual, as if stone itself listened to their growing understanding. The central fountain reflected not just moonlight, but an orange glow from the mountain's direction, an illumination that belonged neither to stars nor human fires. Others had begun to join them, the elderly wine merchant who couldn't sleep, the young scribe whose scrolls kept curling in the unusual heat, the temple priestess who had noticed the sacred flames burning with different colors. Each arrival brought another piece of the puzzle, another thread in a tapestry none had seen clearly, until they stood together in this sacred space. The forum stones beneath their feet held the day's conversations. The weight of countless citizens who had conducted business, made decisions, celebrated victories on these same surfaces. Tonight, those stones seemed to pulse with accumulated memory, as if the very foundation of their civic life was preparing to bear witness to something unprecedented. Their individual fears, when woven together, created a pattern none could ignore. The trembling threads, the restless children, the empty roads, the contaminated water, each observation gained power when shared, private anxieties transforming into collective awareness that felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. A low sound reached them then, so subtle it might have been imagination, but felt by all, the mountain clearing its throat, preparing to speak in a voice that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their world. They looked at each other with the recognition of people who had stumbled upon truth together, who would carry this moment forward regardless of what followed. They stood in the center of their city, citizens whose evening wanderings had revealed the same truth from different angles. The mountain's influence reached everywhere, into their homes, their streets, their most essential needs. What had begun as individual unease was becoming community knowledge, isolation transforming into shared recognition. Around them, Pompeii slept on, unaware that some of its people had begun to read the signs written in ash and trembling earth, in animal behavior and altered water, in empty roads and restless dreams. Their gathering felt both accidental and inevitable, as if the city itself had drawn them together to witness what others weren't yet ready to see. The night that had begun with separate discoveries was ending with the first stirrings of collective understanding, 4 voices beginning to speak the truth their individual observations had been trying to tell them all along. Curiously, they gathered without speaking, drawn by something none could name, but all could feel. The forum steps became their observatory, faces turned toward the mountain that had watched over their city for countless generations. Vesuvius wore a crown tonight, not of snow or cloud, but of light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat against the darkness. The glow was subtle, too faint for any single eye to trust, but unmistakable when witnessed together. Marcus stood beside the young mother whose child had fallen asleep in her arms, the banker next to the slave who swept his floors, the senator's wife shoulder to shoulder with the fisherman's daughter. In this moment, all distinctions dissolved before the mountain's quiet revelation. Some among them remembered their grandparents' stories, tales dismissed as folklore about the mountain's restless sleep, about times when the earth spoke and the wise listened. Those old voices seemed present now, whispering through the warm night air, reminding them that this land held secrets older than Roman rule, deeper than human memory. The air itself seemed to dance above distant slopes, carrying scents they had never noticed, sulfur mixed with something ancient and mineral, the breath of deep earth rising to meet the night sky. Above them, constellations that had guided their ancestors began to fade, not from approaching dawn, but from competing illumination, as if the mountain had decided to write its own story across the heavens. They felt it then, the subtle tremor beneath their feet, not the sharp shake of earthquake, but something more profound, like standing on the chest of some vast sleeping thing as it began to stir. The ground held memory they realized, layers upon layers of time compressed into stone, and now those layers were shifting, preparing to speak. The mountain's silhouette pulsed with inner fire, painting low-hanging clouds in shades of copper and gold. Each pulse seemed to match their own heartbeats, as if Vesuvius had synchronized itself to human rhythm, preparing them for what was to come. They understood without words or conscious thought that this glow was both warning and invitation, the earth preparing to speak in its most elemental voice. The forum steps beneath them grew warmer with each passing moment, as if heat rose through stone channels carved by forces beyond human engineering. Some touched the marble with their palms, feeling the pulse of deep warmth that suggested vast chambers stirring far below, ancient fires awakening from their long slumber. Children in nearby houses began to wake and cry, their voices carrying across the sleeping city like a chorus of unconscious prophecy. The mountain's influence reached into dreams, into the most vulnerable minds, speaking truths that conscious thought couldn't yet accept, but sleeping wisdom recognized and feared. The light above Vesuvius grew stronger, no longer subtle but unmistakable, painting their upturned faces in shades of amber and rose. They had become witnesses to the earth's awakening, participants in a conversation between human consciousness and geological time, between the brief span of individual lives and the vast patience of stone. No one moved to leave, no one suggested they should return to their homes, their beds, their ordinary concerns. They had become witnesses to something larger than themselves, something that connected them not just to each other, but to the very foundations of their world. The mountain breathed with visible rhythm, its ancient sleep ending, and they breathed with it, accepting their role in whatever story was about to unfold. The night air carried new sounds now, not the familiar settling of stone and timber, but something deeper, more primal, the voice of earth itself preparing to speak after centuries of patient silence. They stood together on the threshold between the world they had known and the world that was about to be born, witnesses to transformation that would reshape not just their city, but their understanding of what it meant to live on ground that remembered everything and forgot nothing. Marcus returned to his bakery with hands that still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. The familiar space welcomed him like an old friend, ovens still warm from the day's work, the scent of yeast and grain providing comfort that transcended understanding. He began to prepare tomorrow's bread, his flour-dusted hands working with new reverence. Each fold of dough became a meditation, a prayer without words. The simple act of preparation took on profound meaning. This bread might never be eaten, these loaves might never see completion, yet the work itself had become sacred. His grandfather had taught him that bread was life, that the baker served something larger than hunger, and now Marcus understood the deeper truth of those words. The starter he had maintained for 15 years bubbled quietly in its ceramic crock, generations of wild yeast carrying the memory of every loaf he had ever made. This living culture connected him to his craft's ancient lineage, to the first human hands that had discovered the magic of fermentation. He measured ingredients with the precision of ritual, understanding that some acts of creation must continue even as the world prepared for transformation. The bakery's stone walls seemed to pulse gently with the mountain's distant heartbeat, as if the building itself had become aware of the approaching change. Meaningfully, Marcus worked by lamplight, the golden glow creating shadows that danced like memories across surfaces he had touched thousands of times. His movements fell into the ancient rhythm of his craft, muscle memory connecting him to every baker who had ever shaped dough in darkness before dawn. He found peace in this continuity, this insistence on tomorrow despite tonight's revelations. Bread rising, the dough would rise, the ovens would heat, the morning customers would come, seeking their daily sustenance. Realization. Whether or not those customers would find him here, whether or not the morning would unfold as expected, the bread must still be made. Meaningful silence. This was his offering to whatever gods governed change and continuity, the simple faith that life's essential rhythms must be honored. Final kneading. As he shaped the final loaf, Marcus whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him, words in the old language that blessed both baker and bread. Thoughtfully, his work had become testament, proof that human hands create meaning even in uncertainty's shadow, that some acts of faith transcend fear. Livia's fingers found the threads in darkness, muscle memory guiding her to the work that had sustained 3 generations of women in her family. First light filtered through shutters, illuminating wool that seemed to hold captured starlight, each strand carrying stories she was only beginning to understand. Her evening's weaving had transformed into something far more significant, a conscious act of legacy creation. The pattern emerging beneath her hands spoke of continuity beyond individual lives. Geometric designs her grandmother had taught her, symbols that connected her to countless generations of weavers. She worked now with full awareness of impermanence, each pass of the shuttle both preserving and releasing the past. The cloth would outlast the night's revelations, would carry forward the touch of hands that might not see another sunset. The loom itself told stories, its frame carved from oak that had grown in soil now buried beneath Roman streets, its joints fitted by craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose skill lived on in every straight edge, every true angle. Livia felt their presence as she worked, understanding that her craft was never solitary, but always part of an unbroken chain of creation. Outside, the first birds began their tentative songs, unaware that this dawn might be unlike any other. Inside, Livia wove with new purpose, her pattern incorporating not just traditional motifs, but something entirely her own, a design that captured the night's strange beauty, the mountain's distant glow, the feeling of standing at the edge of transformation. Each color choice became deliberate, each tension adjustment a decision about what would survive. The work took on meditative quality, her breathing synchronizing with the loom's rhythm, her heartbeat matching the steady pass of weft through warp. She understood now why her grandmother had insisted she learn every aspect of the craft, why the old woman had made her practice the most complex patterns until her fingers could work without conscious thought. This knowledge was not just skill, but inheritance, a way of touching the future even when the present grew uncertain. As the pattern revealed itself, Livia saw that she was weaving more than fabric. She was creating a bridge between what was and what would be, a testament to human persistence in the face of mystery. The cloth would speak for her when words failed, would carry forward the story of hands that had worked in darkness, creating beauty even as the earth prepared its own transformation. Her grandmother's wisdom lived in every knot, every carefully chosen color, every decision to continue despite uncertainty. Quintus dipped his reed pen in ink that seemed to flow like dark blood across the page, each word carrying weight beyond its simple meaning. His failing eyes saw with perfect clarity now what had eluded him in full daylight, the true nature of witness, the sacred responsibility of those who record human response to mystery. Dawn light mingled with lamplight across his desk, creating golden illumination perfect for final words. The study's ancient texts seemed to lean inward, as if centuries of accumulated wisdom were attending to the new truth being born under his pen. He wrote not just of the mountain's glow or the night's strange revelations, but of something more profound, how ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, how humanity responded when confronted with forces beyond comprehension or control. His observations became testament, each sentence a bridge between what was and what might be. The young mother cradling her sleeping child, the baker returning to his ovens, the weaver working by lamplight. These were the stories that mattered, the human details that gave meaning to cosmic events. Quintus understood that chronicles were not about gods or emperors, but about the daily courage of those who continued living even when the world prepared to change. The words came faster now, as if time itself were pressing against his consciousness, demanding that certain truths be preserved. He wrote of the collective witness on the forum steps, how strangers had become family in the face of shared recognition, how the mountain's glow had revealed not just geological awakening, but human connection. These were the moments that defined civilizations, not their conquests or monuments, but their capacity for grace under pressure. Outside his window, the city began its daily stirring, unaware that this morning might be unlike any other. Quintus recorded this too, the beautiful persistence of routine, the faith required to begin another day despite uncertainty. His role as chronicler had evolved beyond a mere observation. He had become custodian of meaning, guardian of the stories that explained who they were when faced with the inexplicable. As he completed his final entry, Quintus whispered a prayer to whatever gods governed memory and preservation. His words would serve as bridge between worlds, carrying forward not just facts, but the essence of human experience when confronted with transformation. Whether or not anyone would remain to read these testimonies, the act of writing itself had become sacred, proof that consciousness persisted, that some stories demanded telling even if no audience survived to receive them. Marcus Flavius stood in the darkness of his bakery, his hands resting flat against the worn wooden counter that had known his touch for 30 years. The stone ovens held their heat like sleeping animals, their warmth radiating into the pre-dawn stillness. Flower motes hung suspended in the moonlight that filtered through the high windows, each particle a tiny world caught between earth and sky. He breathed deeply, and there it was again, that taste on the night air. Not ash from his fires, but something else, something that seemed to drift from a great distance, yet felt intimately close. His hands, permanently dusted with flour, knew every grain and texture of this place. The wooden surfaces, smooth from decades of use, the stone that had absorbed countless fires, the familiar weight of tools hanging from their hooks. The recognition came not as thought, but as certainty settling in his bones, the way dough knows when it is risen enough, the way bread knows when it is ready. He had spent his life reading the subtle signs of fermentation, of heat, of timing, and now his body read something else entirely. There was a sound, so low it might have been his own heartbeat, or thunder, or the mountain itself breathing. But Marcus knew thunder, knew the way it rolled across the bay, and this was different. This was the sound of the earth itself preparing to speak. The moonlight created geometric patterns on the flour-dusted floors, and in those patterns he saw the bread he would not bake tomorrow, the customers who would not come, the ordinary morning that would not arrive. Yet there was no fear in this knowing, only a strange peace, as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment of recognition. His fingers traced the edge of the counter, feeling every nick and scar, every place where a knife had slipped or dough had been kneaded with particular urgency. These marks were his history, the record of countless dawns when he had stood in this same spot, preparing to feed his neighbors, to continue the ancient ritual of transforming grain into sustenance. The scent of tomorrow's bread hung in the air. He had mixed the dough before retiring, as he had every night for decades. But now he understood that some preparations serve purposes beyond their immediate intention. The bread would not rise in his ovens, but something else would rise instead, something vast and transforming. The night air stirred the flour dust, creating small whirlwinds that caught the moonlight. Marcus watched them dance, these tiny storms that would settle and be still. He thought of his father, who had taught him to read the language of yeast and heat, who had stood in this same spot and felt the same certainty that comes only to those who work with their hands, who understand the patience required for transformation. His eyes grew heavy, not with exhaustion, but with acceptance. The recognition that had settled in his bones spread through his body like warmth from the ovens, and he knew that when dawn came, it would bring changes he could not imagine, but somehow had always expected. In the darkness of his bakery, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the familiar sense of grain and fire, Marcus Flavius found himself ready for whatever the mountain would bring. Livia Cassia's fingers moved along the threads of her unfinished tapestry, each strand a choice, a day, a small decision that had led to this moment. The loom stood patient in the moonlight that streamed through her window, its wooden frame casting intricate shadows across the room. She had worked on this piece for months, thinking she understood its pattern, believing she controlled its design. But now, in the silver light, she saw something different. The threads she had considered mistakes, the colors that seemed wrong, the places where her tension had been uneven. These were not errors at all, but necessary elements in a design larger than her intention. Her hands knew what her mind had been slow to grasp, that every thread was exactly where it needed to be. The wool and linen gleamed under her fingertips, some threads rough with the memory of the sheep and fields they came from, others smooth with the processing of many hands. She had learned to weave from her grandmother, who had learned from hers, an unbroken line of women passing down not just technique, but something deeper, an understanding that weaving was a conversation between intention and surrender. Outside her window, the night carried unfamiliar scents, something that made her pause in her tracing of the threads. The air felt different, charged with possibility or change. But her fingers continued their journey across the tapestry, reading the story she had been telling without knowing its ending. Each thread vibrated slightly under her touch, as if the entire piece were alive, as if it were not merely a creation, but a living thing that had used her hands to bring itself into being. The warp threads stretched tight on the loom, held their tension perfectly. She had learned long ago that the right tension was everything. Too loose and the pattern would not hold, too tight and the threads would break. She thought of all the tapestries that had come before this one, all the patterns that had been completed by other hands in other times. Some had been lost to fire or flood, others had worn thin with age and use, but the act of weaving itself continued, passed from one generation to the next, like a sacred trust. The moonlight shifted, and suddenly she could see the pattern differently, not as something she was making, but as something that was making itself through her. The threads seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and she realized that she had been not the creator, but the instrument, the means by which this particular design had chosen to enter the world. Her calloused fingers, stained with dyes and worn smooth by years of handling thread, had never felt more sensitive. Every fiber spoke to her of its journey from plant or animal to thread, from thread to pattern, from pattern to meaning. She understood now that the tapestry would complete itself in ways she could not foresee, that her role was to trust the process, to let her hands follow the wisdom they had learned through countless hours of practice. There was a sound so low it seemed to come from the earth itself, and the threads on her loom vibrated in response. She looked at her hands, at the unfinished work, at the moonlight that transformed everything it touched. Whatever came with dawn, this moment of understanding would be woven into the pattern, another thread in the vast design that connected all things. Her fingers grew still on the threads, and she felt herself becoming part of the larger weaving, another strand in the endless tapestry of time. Quintus Hortensius set down his stylus and looked at the words he had just written on the wax tablet, contemplatively. Not a record of accounts or legal matters, but something simpler, something that had emerged from his fingers without conscious thought. The night is beautiful. The mountain sleeps. We are content. His failing eyes could barely make out the letters in the lamplight, but his fingers knew their shape, knew the weight of each word pressed into the wax. Around him, scrolls and tablets held the accumulated words of his lifetime, contracts and correspondence, records of births and deaths, the careful documentation of ordinary life. But now, in the flickering light of his oil lamp, he understood that these final words might be the most important he had ever written, though he could not say why. The lamp flame wavered, casting dancing shadows across the papyrus and parchment that surrounded him. In its movement, he seemed to see all the words he had written across the decades, flowing like water towards some distant shore he had never imagined. His fingers, ink-stained and slightly trembling with age, had formed thousands upon thousands of letters, each one a small act of faith that meaning could be preserved, that thoughts could outlive the minds that conceived them. The night air stirred the edges of his papers, creating a soft rustling that sounded almost like whispered conversations. He thought of all the scribes who had come before him, all the words that had been carefully preserved, only to be lost again, and all the words that had somehow survived against impossible odds. The wax tablet felt warm under his palm, the words still soft enough to be erased, to be changed. But he knew he would not change them. There was something about their simplicity that felt complete, as if they contained everything that needed to be said about this moment, this night, this strange sense of ending and beginning that hung in the air. The scent of lamp oil mixed with the smell of old parchment, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and somehow final. He had spent so many nights in this room, surrounded by the tools of his trade, reed pens and bronze styluses, bottles of ink made from soot and gum, the smooth surfaces of wax and papyrus that had received his thoughts and transformed them into something that could be shared, preserved, remembered. There was a sound so low it seemed to come from beneath the building itself, and the flame of his lamp flickered in response. Quintus felt his heart quicken, not with fear, but with a strange recognition, as if this sound were something he had been expecting without knowing it. He looked again at the words on the tablet. The night is beautiful, the mountain sleeps, we are content. Such simple words, but in their simplicity lay something he had spent his life trying to capture in more elaborate language, the truth of a moment fully experienced, fully accepted. His fingers traced the letters one more time, feeling their texture in the wax. He thought of who might find these words, who might read them and wonder about the man who wrote them in the final hours of an ordinary night that was not ordinary at all. Perhaps that was the real purpose of writing, not to preserve facts and figures, but to leave traces of what it felt like to be alive, to be present, to witness the beauty of the world even as it prepared to change. The lamp flame steadied, casting a warm circle of light around his workspace. Quintus felt his eyelids growing heavy, not with exhaustion, but with a deep contentment, as if the words on the tablet had somehow completed something that had been incomplete. In the silence of his study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, he prepared to rest, knowing that some words find their way into the world exactly when they are needed most. Claudia's hand rose and fell with her child's breathing, each breath a small miracle she had witnessed thousands of times, yet never truly seen until now. Contemplatively, the child's face in the starlight appeared both ancient and new, as if holding all the children who had ever slept and all who ever would. Her calloused hands, worn from years of washing clothes in the river, had never felt more gentle than they did now, resting on the small chest that contained an entire world. The rough wooden bed frame creaked softly as she shifted her weight, careful not to disturb the child's sleep. Through the small window, starlight created patterns on the wall, and in those shifting shadows she saw all the nights she had kept this vigil, all the times she had watched and worried and wondered what the future would bring. She knew without knowing how she knew that this watching, this love, this fierce tenderness would continue beyond whatever came with dawn. It was not a thought, but a certainty that settled in her bones, the way a mother's body knows her child's needs before the child speaks them. The worn blankets, patched and repatched over the years, held the warmth of their bodies and the memory of all the nights they had provided comfort. Each patch told a story: the blue fabric from an old dress, the brown wool from a cloak that had outlived its usefulness, the careful stitches that held everything together. Like her life, she thought, like the way love accumulates and endures despite wear and hardship. Outside, the night carried sounds she had never noticed before, not just the familiar calls of night birds and the distant murmur of the sea, but something else, something that made the air itself feel different. But her attention remained fixed on the rise and fall of her child's breathing, on the miracle of life continuing its steady rhythm despite all uncertainty. Her fingers traced the child's hairline, so soft it barely registered as touch. This small person had emerged from her body, but now seemed to belong to something larger than either of them, to the future, to possibility, to the great chain of being that connected all mothers to all children across all time. She thought of her own mother, dead now these 5 years, who had kept the same vigil over her. The memory came not as sadness but as comfort, the understanding that this love was not hers alone, but part of an unbroken line stretching back to the first mother who had ever watched her child sleep and felt this same fierce protectiveness, this same wonder at the fragility and resilience of life. The sound came from somewhere far away, so low it might have been her own heartbeat, or the child's, or the heartbeat of the earth itself. But it did not frighten her. Instead, it seemed to confirm what she already knew, that great changes were coming, that the world was preparing to transform itself in ways she could not imagine. Her hand continued its gentle rhythm on the child's chest, and she understood that this touch, this love, this moment of perfect tenderness would somehow persist beyond whatever tomorrow brought. Love like this did not end with circumstances. It became part of the fabric of existence itself, woven into the pattern of what it meant to be human. The child stirred slightly, making the small sounds of dreams, and Claudia felt her heart expand with such tenderness it seemed it might burst. She had carried this child in her body, nursed this child at her breast, watched this child take first steps and speak first words. But only now did she fully understand the magnitude of what had been entrusted to her care. The starlight shifted across the wall, and in its movement she saw all the mothers who had ever kept this vigil, all the hands that had ever rested on sleeping children, all the love that had ever been given freely and without condition. Her eyelids grew heavy, but her hand remained steady on the small chest, keeping time with the eternal rhythm of breath and heartbeat. In that rhythm, she found a peace deeper than sleep, a love stronger than any force the world could summon against it. Thalia stood at the window of her small chamber, her fingers tracing the iron bars that had defined her world for 7 years. Contemplatively, the moonlight fell through the geometric shadows onto her face, illuminating eyes that held the depth of someone who had learned to find vastness in confinement. Beyond the bars, Mount Vesuvius rose like a sleeping giant against the star-scattered sky, its dark bulk breathing with the rhythm of the earth itself. Soft realization. Tonight something had shifted in her understanding. The bars no longer felt like imprisonment, but like the frame of a painting she had been slowly learning to see. Her Greek heritage whispered through her blood, stories her grandmother had told of philosophers who discovered that the mind could travel farther than any ship, could explore territories no master could claim or sell. The stone beneath her bare feet held the coolness of centuries, each block placed by hands that had also known servitude, also known the weight of other men's dreams. Pause. She could feel their presence in the walls, a communion of the bound that transcended time. The mortar between the stones seemed to pulse with their collective breath, their shared understanding that freedom was not a place but a recognition. Peaceful acceptance. She pressed her palm against the cool stone wall, feeling the pulse of the mountain through the very foundations of the house. The distinction between slave and free seemed suddenly arbitrary, a human invention that had nothing to do with the deeper currents of existence. The mountain breathed, and she breathed with it, no longer fighting the rhythm, but joining it. Memories surfaced like bubbles in still water, her mother's voice singing lullabies in the dialect of their island home, the taste of honey cakes shared on feast days, the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder the last time she saw him. Internal complexity. These memories had once been sources of pain, reminders of what was lost. Now they felt like gifts, like seeds of herself that no master could touch or diminish. Wisely, her intelligence, which her masters valued for keeping accounts and managing correspondence, had always been her secret rebellion. But now she understood it differently, not as resistance, but as recognition. Consciousness itself was the territory no one could own, the freedom that existed before and beyond all human categories. The night air moved through the window, carrying scents of jasmine and distant sea salt. She thought of all the small moments of beauty she had gathered, like coins in a hidden purse. The way morning light fell across the courtyard, the sound of rain on roof tiles, the taste of stolen figs from the garden tree. These had been her true possessions, and they were hers absolutely. A night bird called from somewhere beyond the villa's walls, its song threading through the darkness like a needle through fabric, stitching together earth and sky. She listened until the call faded, then listened to the silence that followed, understanding that both song and silence were forms of the same freedom. The mountain seemed to pulse with its own ancient knowledge, and she felt herself part of something larger than the small human dramas of ownership and servitude. The iron bars caught moonlight and threw it back in patterns that seemed almost like writing, like a message she was finally ready to read. In this moment, standing between confinement and the infinite sky, Talia understood that she had always been free in the ways that mattered most. The recognition settled into her bones like warmth, and she smiled at the mountain that would soon change everything, grateful for this final lesson in the nature of true liberation. Her eyes grew heavy with the weight of understanding, and she knew that whatever came with dawn, she would meet it as herself, completely and finally free. Lucius Caecilius moved through his wine cellar like a priest performing his final benediction, his weathered hands touching each amphora with the tenderness of a father blessing his children. The lamplight flickered across the curved clay surfaces, creating shadows that danced between the neat rows of vessels that held wine from vineyards across the empire: Gaul, Hispania, the hills of Latium. Each touch was both farewell and gratitude. This amphora held wine from vines that grew in soil where his grandfather had once walked. That one contained the pressed essence of grapes that had ripened under Spanish sun, carried here by ships that had weathered storms he would never know. The true journey of the wine was not from vineyard to cellar, but from earth to joy, from grape to the laughter that echoed in dining rooms throughout Pompeii. His generous heart had always understood what his mind was only now articulating clearly: that wealth was not what you accumulated, but what you gave away. Every amphora he had sold had carried more than wine. It had carried the possibility of celebration, of friendship sealed over shared cups, of sorrows eased by the gentle warmth that spread through chest and limbs. The cellar held the memory of 30 years of commerce, but commerce transformed by care into something approaching love. He remembered the young bride who had come to buy wine for her wedding feast, her eyes bright with nervous joy. The old man who had purchased the finest vintage to toast his son's return from military service. The widow who had bought sweet wine to remember her husband's favorite. The coins they had paid him were the least part of the transaction. The real profit had been in the connections made, the small part he had played in the city's endless cycle of celebration and comfort. His wine had become part of other people's most important moments, and in that transformation he had found his own meaning. The cool air of the cellar carried the rich, complex aroma that had been his daily companion for decades. He breathed it in deeply, understanding that this scent would outlive him, would linger in these stone walls long after the last amphora was emptied. The wine gave itself completely to become something that brought people together. And in that giving, it achieved a kind of immortality. Lucius placed both palms against the largest amphora, feeling the clay's coolness and the wine's patient presence within. His life's work surrounded him in these quiet vessels, each one a small act of generosity multiplied across years until it became a philosophy, a way of being in the world that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with love. The mountain's distant breathing seemed to harmonize with the wine's slow aging, and he understood that he had been part of something larger than commerce. He had been part of the city's heartbeat, the daily miracle of people caring for each other through small acts of provision and grace. His eyes grew heavy with the satisfaction of a life well lived, and he leaned against the amphora like a man coming home. Gaius Plinius sat in perfect stillness among the scattered scrolls that had been his life's work, his hands folded in his lap like those of a man who had reached the end of a long and satisfying journey. The stylus lay beside him, its bronze tip no longer gleaming with fresh ink, and somehow this felt exactly right. The moment when the chronicler must stop chronicling and become part of the story itself. Around him lay the collected voices of Pompeii, the baker's account of his father's recipes, the weaver's description of patterns passed down through generations, the fisherman's tales of storms weathered and catches celebrated. He had gathered these stories like a careful gardener collecting seeds, but now he understood that the greatest story was unfolding beyond his ability to capture it in words. The papyrus beneath his fingers held the texture of countless hours, the slight roughness where his palm had rested during long afternoons of transcription. Each scroll carried not just words, but the weight of the moments in which they were written, the quality of light at different hours, the distant sounds of the city that had formed the backdrop to each conversation, each revelation. The room held the accumulated weight of all the stories he had preserved, but also the growing awareness of the story he was about to enter. Not as observer, but as participant, the sleeping city around him was writing itself into history with each breath its citizens took, each dream that moved behind closed eyelids, each small act of love performed in darkness. He could hear the subtle sounds that marked the deep hours of night, the settling of timber and cooling air, the distant murmur of the sea against the harbor walls, the almost inaudible whisper of scrolls shifting in their careful arrangements. These sounds had become the music of his solitude, the rhythm against which all his words had been written. He thought of all the scrolls in Alexandria, all the histories written and yet to be written, and realized that they were all part of a single endless story, the story of human beings trying to understand their place in the vast mystery of existence. Tonight, He felt himself dissolving into that larger narrative, his individual voice joining the chorus that had been singing since the first human looked up at stars and wondered. The lamp flame beside him burned steady and low, casting shadows that seemed to dance with their own intelligence across the walls. In those shifting patterns of light and darkness, he could almost see the faces of all the people whose stories he had preserved. The young mother who spoke of her children's laughter, the old soldier who described battles fought in distant lands, the merchant who knew the taste of wines from every corner of the empire. The mountain's presence filled the window like a patient teacher waiting for the final lesson to be learned. Vesuvius had been part of every story he had collected, the silent witness to all the small human dramas he had documented. The farmers who planted in its fertile soil, the winemakers who praised its mineral-rich earth, the children who played in its shadow, all of them had been writing the mountain's story without knowing it. His role as storyteller was ending, but his role in the story was just beginning. The distinction between teller and tale dissolved like morning mist, and he found in this surrender a peace more profound than any he had known in all his years of careful observation and meticulous recording. The scrolls around him seemed to breathe with their own life, the words he had written joining the vast conversation between past and future, between human voice and eternal silence. He had spent his life believing that stories needed to be captured, preserved, held safe against time's erosion. Now he understood that the greatest stories were living things that included their tellers, that transformed everyone who touched them. The first pale light of dawn touched the window's edge, and Gaius smiled at the approaching day that would make storytellers of them all. His eyes closed, not in sleep, but in recognition, the recognition that he had always been both author and character in a story too large and beautiful for any single voice to contain. In that understanding, he found the deepest satisfaction any storyteller could know, the moment when life itself becomes the perfect narrative, and silence becomes the most eloquent word of all. Marcus Flavius placed both palms flat against the cooling stones of his ovens, feeling their stored heat like the heartbeat of his life's work. For 30 years, these fires had burned under his careful tending, transforming simple flour and water into the daily bread that had sustained his neighbors, his city, his world. Now the ovens rested, their work complete, and somehow this felt not like ending, but like fulfillment. The bakery held the memory of every dawn he had risen to light the fires, every loaf he had pulled from the glowing chambers, every customer who had entered his shop with the trust that he would provide what they needed to face another day. The flour-dusted surfaces bore the invisible imprint of countless hands, his own, his father's before him, the apprentices he had trained who carried his knowledge into their own shops throughout the empire. He moved among his tools with the familiarity of a musician touching beloved instruments, the wooden paddle worn smooth by his grip, the measuring cups that had portioned out thousands of loaves, the great stone mills that had ground grain into the powder of possibility. Each tool held the weight of ritual, the accumulated grace of work done with care and pride. The scent of yeast and grain permeated everything, a perfume more precious to him than any exotic spice. This smell had been his daily companion, had clung to his clothes and hair, had announced his profession to anyone who came near. It was the smell of transformation, of the ancient alchemy that turned seed into sustenance, Earth's gift into human nourishment. He thought of all the occasions his bread had graced, wedding feasts where young couples had broken loaves together, funeral meals where mourners had found comfort in simple food, daily dinners where families had gathered around tables made sacred by shared nourishment. His work had been woven into the fabric of the city's life so completely that he had become, without realizing it, one of its essential threads. The dawn light crept through the shop windows, illuminating motes of flower that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The bread for today would not be baked, and this felt exactly right, a completion rather than an interruption. Some rhythms were meant to end, some cycles were meant to close, and in that ending lay a perfection he had never anticipated. Wise recognition. His hands, permanently stained with flour despite countless washings, bore the mark of his calling as clearly as any priest's or soldier's. These hands had kneaded thousands of loaves into being, had felt the moment when dough transformed from mere ingredients into something alive and breathing, ready for the fire's final blessing. The cooling ovens seemed to sigh with their own contentment, their stone hearts gradually releasing the heat they had held through the night. Content, exhale. Marcus pressed his forehead against the warm stone, feeling the pulse of banked fires and the deeper pulse of earth itself, the source of all grain, all bread, all nourishment. Final blessing. He had given his life to feeding others, and in that giving had found his own deepest nourishment. The city would remember him not in monuments, but in the daily miracle of bread, in the hands of bakers yet unborn, who would light their own fires and continue the ancient work of transformation. Sleepily, his eyes grew heavy with the satisfaction of work completed, purpose fulfilled, and he smiled at the mountain that would soon change everything, peacefully, grateful for a life spent in service to the most basic and sacred of human needs. Fading. In the growing light, surrounded by the tools and scents of his calling, Marcus Flavius found the peace that comes only to those who have given themselves completely to their work. Eternal silence beginning, and in that peace discovered the deepest form of prayer. Livia Cassia stepped back from her loom as the first threads of dawn light entered her weaving room, and for the first time in 40 years of working at this same frame, she saw not an unfinished tapestry, but something complete. The pattern she had been creating, thread by careful thread, day after patient day, revealed itself suddenly as whole, as if it had always known its own ending and had been guiding her hands toward this moment of recognition. The wooden shuttle rested in the basket beside her, worn smooth by decades of passing through her fingers, its surface polished to the color of honey by countless hours of work. She could feel the memory of every thread it had carried, every passage it had made through the warp, every small choice that had contributed to the pattern now spread before her like a prayer made visible. The empty warp strings stretched before her, waiting for tomorrow's work, but they no longer seemed incomplete. They seemed expectant, like a question perfectly posed, like the pause between notes that makes music possible. Her hands, which had guided 10,000 threads through their intricate dance, rested at her sides with a stillness she had never allowed herself before. Memories wove themselves through her consciousness, like threads through fabric. Her mother teaching her the first simple over-under rhythm, her daughter's small fingers learning to hold the shuttle, the quiet conversations that had filled this room over the years. Each memory carried its own color, its own texture, and she could see how they had all contributed to the pattern of her life, how even the difficult passages had been necessary to the whole. The morning light caught each thread differently, some gleaming like captured sunlight, others deep and shadowed like the spaces between stars. She could see now how every choice had been necessary, the crimson thread she had hesitated over for weeks, the gold she had thought too bold, even the places where her attention had wandered and the pattern had shifted slightly from her original design. The room itself seemed to hold the accumulated patience of all those years, the walls that had witnessed her struggles with difficult patterns, the floor worn smooth by her daily movements, the window that had framed the changing seasons as she worked. This space had become a temple to the slow miracle of creation, to the way beauty emerges from the marriage of intention and surrender. Those small deviations, which had once seemed like mistakes, now appeared as the most essential elements of the whole. They gave the tapestry its life, its breath, its humanity. A perfect pattern would have been cold, lifeless, but this pattern lived. She could hear the city beginning to stir beyond her walls, the baker lighting his ovens, the water seller calling his first rounds, the eternal rhythm of human activity that had provided the backdrop to all her work. These sounds had become part of her patterns, woven into the very fabric of her creations through the simple act of being present while she worked. The wooden frame held its tension and release in perfect balance, as it had for decades. But now Livia understood that the frame itself was part of the pattern. The boundaries that had seemed like limitations were actually what made the design possible. Without edges, there could be no center. Without ending, there could be no meaning. She touched one of the warp strings gently, feeling its tautness, its readiness. Tomorrow she might begin another pattern, or she might not. It no longer mattered in the way it once had. The loom would wait, patient as stone, holding its possibilities in perfect suspension. The quality of light in the room shifted subtly as the sun climbed higher, and with it came the understanding that this moment, this recognition of completion, was itself a thread in some larger pattern she could not see but could feel herself part of. The weaver and the woven, the pattern and the one who creates it, all part of the same vast design. Through the open window came the sound of the city waking, vendors calling, children laughing, the eternal rhythm of human life continuing its ancient dance. But here, in this room, in this moment of recognition, time seemed to pause, to gather itself around this understanding. That every thread was necessary, even the spaces between them. Especially the spaces between them. In those spaces, the pattern breathed, lived, became something more than the sum of its parts, became a reflection of the mystery that holds all patterns, all lives, all moments of completion in its vast and loving embrace. Claudia's hand continued its gentle rise and fall with her child's breathing. and in that rhythm she found something larger than herself, something that existed beyond the boundaries of this room, this night, this single life. Quiet acceptance, her love, had become a force of nature, like the tide or the turning of seasons, inevitable, eternal, beyond the reach of circumstance. The child's face in the growing dawn light seemed to contain all children who had ever lived, all mothers who had ever watched over sleeping forms with this same fierce tenderness. Ultimate calm, Claudia understood now that her vigil was not hers alone. She was part of an unbroken chain of guardianship that stretched back to the beginning of human time and forward into whatever future awaited. Soft breath. The worn blanket beneath her hand had been washed countless times, had covered this small body through fevers and nightmares, through growth spurts and quiet dreams. Each washing had made it softer, more perfect for its purpose. Like love itself, it had been refined through use, through the patient repetition of care. Pause. She remembered her own mother's hands, how they had felt against her forehead during childhood illnesses, cool, certain, carrying within their touch the promise that all pain was temporary, that love endured beyond suffering. Now her hands carried that same promise forward, linking generations in an endless circle of protection. She could hear the city beginning to stir, the sound of water being drawn from wells, of doors opening, of voices calling across courtyards. Peacefully, but these sounds seemed distant, filtered through the protective sphere of her watching. Nothing could penetrate this space where love stood guard, where a mother's attention created a sanctuary more secure than any walls. The child stirred slightly, one small hand moving across the blanket like a sleeper reaching for something in a dream. Contemplatively, what dreams came to children? What landscapes did they explore in sleep? What stories did they live in the theater of their minds? Claudia would never know, and that not knowing was part of love's mystery, part of its gift. Temple bells in distance, to love someone was to accept the vast territories of their inner life that would always remain unknown, unexplored. It was to stand guard at the border of another consciousness, protecting without possessing, watching without intruding. This was the deepest wisdom of motherhood, to hold without grasping, to shelter without confining. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across the child's sleeping features. In that play of light and shadow, Claudia saw time itself moving, the inevitable passage that would transform this sleeping child into someone she could not yet imagine. But that future person would carry within them this moment, this love, this perfect safety of being watched over in sleep. The light grew stronger, painting the child's face with gold. In that face, Claudia saw her own mother's face, her grandmother's, the faces of all the women who had kept this vigil through the centuries. She saw, too, the face her child might wear as an adult, as a parent, continuing this ancient practice of love, watching over vulnerability. Her hand rose and fell, marking time not with minutes or hours, but with heartbeats, with a fundamental rhythm that connected all living things. This was prayer without words, worship without ceremony, the simple, profound act of bearing witness to life's continuation. The child's breathing deepened, settled into the profound rest that comes just before true waking. But for now, in these last moments of night's protection, Claudia continued her watch, understanding finally that this love she felt was not hers to possess, but hers to channel, a force that flowed through her from some inexhaustible source, connecting her to every mother who had ever lived, every child who had ever slept in perfect trust. In that connection, she found a peace that would endure beyond time, beyond understanding, beyond the reach of any earthly change. Pompeii breathed like a sleeping person, its streets and houses rising and falling with the collective rhythm of 10,000 dreams. From above, the city revealed its true nature, not a collection of separate buildings and lives, but a single living entity, complete in itself, beautiful in its wholeness. The streets curved like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of human connection from the forum to the furthest residential quarters. Each intersection was a heartbeat, each doorway a breath, each window a watchful eye in the city's sleeping face. The worn stones of the roads held the memory of countless footsteps, children running to school, merchants carrying their wares, lovers meeting in secret, families gathering for evening meals. The fountains continued their eternal song, water flowing from the aqueducts that connected this place to the mountains, to the sea, to the vast network of Roman civilization. But tonight the water seemed to flow not just through the city's stone channels, but through its very soul, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of generations who had called this place home. In the growing light, the mosaics embedded in doorways and courtyards began to gleam, tiny pieces of colored stone arranged by patient hands into patterns that would outlast their makers. Each tessera had been chosen, placed, fitted into a larger design by craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose vision lived on in these small, perfect arrangements of beauty. Every threshold told a story. The baker's shop where bread had been kneaded and baked for 3 centuries, the yeast and grain transformed daily into sustenance, into the staff of life that connected this place to the great cycle of harvest and hunger, abundance and need. The temple where prayers had risen like incense, carrying the hopes and fears of the faithful toward whatever gods might listen. The small houses where ordinary people had lived extraordinary lives, falling in love, raising children, growing old, finding meaning in the simple repetition of daily tasks. The amphitheater held within its curved walls the memory of voices raised in song, of actors speaking words that had moved audiences to tears and laughter. The stone seats had been worn smooth by countless bodies, each person who sat there adding their presence to the collective experience of story, of shared emotion, of the human need to gather and witness the dramas that gave meaning to existence. The city had lived fully, through festivals that filled the amphitheater with joy, through sorrows that emptied the streets with grief, through the countless ordinary days that formed the true substance of human existence. It had been a stage for every kind of human drama, a witness to every variety of human experience. The harbor, now silent, remembered the arrival of ships carrying goods from distant lands, spices from the east, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul. Each cargo had brought not just commerce, but connection, proof that this city was part of something larger, a node in the great web of human exchange that spanned the known world. Now it rested in perfect stillness, complete in itself. The amphitheater held the echo of 10,000 performances, The baths retained the warmth of countless bodies seeking comfort and connection. The gardens breathed with the memory of seasons turning, of flowers blooming and fading, of the eternal cycle that makes all endings also beginnings. Mount Vesuvius watched over the sleeping city like a parent over a beloved child, its ancient presence a reminder of the larger forces that shaped all human endeavors. The mountain had been there before the first Roman settlement, would remain long after the last human voice fell silent. But for now, in this perfect moment of dawn breaking, it served as guardian, as witness, as the eternal backdrop against which this particular human story had unfolded. The city's walls, built to protect but also to define, to create the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the unknown, stood patient in the growing light. They had witnessed the daily passage of citizens and strangers, had heard 1,000 languages spoken in the markets, had sheltered countless dreams and ambitions within their embrace. Every stone, every worn step, every piece of graffiti scratched into a wall by some long-dead hand held the memory of lives fully lived. The city was a book written in stone and mortar, in the accumulated choices of generations who had found in this place something worth building, worth preserving, worth calling home. The first light of true dawn touched the rooftops with gentle benediction, and the city stirred slightly in its sleep, like a dreamer approaching the moment of waking. In the growing warmth, the very stones seemed to exhale the day's first breath, releasing into the air the essence of all the life they had witnessed, all the love they had sheltered. But for now, in these last moments of perfect rest, Pompeii breathed quietly, holding within its sleeping form all the love, all the hope, all the simple human beauty that had ever found expression within its walls. It was complete, and in its completion, it was eternal. Mount Vesuvius stood in the growing dawn light, ancient beyond human measure, patient beyond human understanding, holding within its stone heart the gift it had been preparing for centuries. The mountain had watched over this city, these people, these individual lives with the patience of stone and the love of a guardian, seeing in their daily struggles and small triumphs something precious beyond measure. From its slopes the mountain could see the whole pattern, not just this single city, but the vast network of human civilization that spread across the peninsula like a web of light. Roads connecting village to village, aqueducts carrying life-giving water across impossible distances, the accumulated wisdom of generations encoded in law and custom, art and architecture, in the simple human capacity to create meaning from chaos. The mountain breathed deeply, feeling the weight of its responsibility and the lightness of its love. What was coming was not destruction but transformation, a way of holding this moment, these lives, these small perfect details of human existence in eternal amber. The baker's loaves cooling in their ovens, the child sleeping in her mother's arms, the weaver stepping back from her completed pattern, all of it would be preserved, held safe in stone's embrace. For millennia, the mountain had been both creator and destroyer, its eruptions bringing fertile soil that made this land a garden, its periods of quiet allowing civilizations to flourish in its shadow. It had learned patience from the stars, acceptance from the turning seasons, love from watching the endless creativity of human hearts. The city spread below like a beloved child, its streets and buildings catching the first light of what would be its last dawn. But the mountain knew that endings were also beginnings, that what seemed like loss was often transformation into something more permanent, more beautiful than what had come before. temple bells in distance. In the stone archives of the earth, other cities slept. Herculaneum, Stabiae, settlements whose names had been forgotten, but whose essence remained, held safe in the mountain's memory. They had not been destroyed, but translated, lifted from the temporary realm of daily life into the eternal realm of perfect preservation. The mountain felt a stirring deep within its core, the ancient forces that connected it to the earth's molten heart, beginning their slow dance toward release. But there was no urgency, no violence in this stirring, only the patient unfolding of a plan that had been written in stone and fire long before the first human foot had touched this soil. What came next would be an act of love, the kind of love that preserves by transforming, that saves by seeming to destroy. The mountain would wrap this perfect moment, this completed pattern of human life, in its eternal embrace, ensuring that nothing beautiful would ever be truly lost. The sky lightened toward perfect blue, and the mountain stood ready to give its gift to eternity. In preserving this night, this peace, this moment of completion, it offered the greatest gift one consciousness could give another, the promise that love finds a way to make all things permanent, that beauty once created becomes part of the eternal pattern that holds all patterns within its vast and loving design. The mountain breathed once more, deeply and peacefully, feeling the weight of its ancient purpose and the joy of its fulfillment. In the growing light, it stood as guardian and witness, as preserver and transformer, ready to wrap this beloved city in the gentle embrace of eternity,